Senior Director of Philanthropic Partnerships. I'm so pleased to welcome you today to this private member briefing in partnership with the Global China Hub. Today's call is the second in a new series of private briefings we'll be offering to our members, featuring expert commentary on timely and relevant global developments. In November, we'll be exploring learnings from the midterms with the Digital Forensic Research Lab, and in December, we'll be offering a session with the Africa Center in advance of the African Leaders Summit. We hope you'll join us for those as well. Turning to today's discussion, we'll be joined by four experts who are going to help us unpack the impact of China's 20th Party Congress and what it will have on its global relations. As a reminder, we'll be following Chatham House rules. Comments are not for attribution. John Culver is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and a former CIA senior intelligence officer. Johanna Gao is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. She also serves as Regional Director for Asia at the International Republican Institute. Hung Tran is the former Executive Managing Director at the Institute for International Finance and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center. And finally, moderating today's conversation is Dave Shulman, Senior Director of the Global China Hub, where he leads the Council's work on China. Dave served for nearly a dozen years as one of the US government's top experts on East Asia. Dave, I'll turn things over to you to get us started. Thank you and welcome.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for being with us today. As Sarah said, I'm Dave Shulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which, as the name suggests, has the unique mission of leveraging the expertise on China across the Atlantic Council's 16 centers to research and devise allied solutions to the most pressing challenges posed by China's global rise. I'm very happy to both kick off and moderate this discussion today, which is, of course, very timely, with the Chinese Communist Party in the midst of its 20th Party Congress. As many of you know, the most important political event in China that takes place every 5 years and which will conclude this weekend. Of course, the most important decision from the Congress will be the widely expected announcement of Xi Jinping's third term as General Secretary of the Communist Party. And that announcement and the final lineup of personnel movements on the Politburo Standing Committee that will be revealed over the weekend, and potentially some new language elevating even further the importance of Xi Jinping's intellectual contributions to party ideology, are going to reveal that Xi has run the table at this Congress, and we expect underscore that power today in China emanates from only one source, and that's Xi Jinping. And there's no reason to expect that Xi is going to hand that power over to a successor in 5 or even 10 years' time. And it'll underscore as well that even if there are those within the system who oppose Xi's rule, and there certainly are, they're too weak or too divided to push back. And this leaves us in a situation where Xi Jinping has a level of power to shape policy and China's future course of action on all the areas of greatest concern to the United States and the world, not to mention the Chinese people. So the question we're going to focus on today is, what can we already deduce about that course of action under a Xi unbounded type of scenario? And how much does this Congress actually matter, given the traditional focus around this time in the party's political calendar on who gets placed where and who's going to be identified as successor? All of those things are not in play. So what can we learn from what we've heard already from the Party Congress or what we've seen to indicate where China's headed? I do think that although Party Congresses don't offer much in the way of detailed policy, and that can be expected more around the National People's Congress, which is held in March, it is instructive to look at Xi's work report that he delivered on Saturday night to get a sense of where he intends to take the country. I think most analysts agree that there were no big surprises in the speech, but that's not necessarily a good thing, given the trends that we've been watching in China, an increasingly repressive approach domestically, a much more aggressive approach abroad under Xi Jinping. Specifically, many had hoped for some indication of a relaxation of China's zero COVID policies, these policies of strict border controls, aggressive isolation of close contacts, sudden and sustained lockdowns of entire cities in China. But that doesn't appear to be happening from what we can gather from the speech. And just today we had fresh news about new lockdowns in the city of Xi'an. So this is all very concerning, both for the Chinese people and what this means for their lives, but it also is concerning in terms of the impact on China's economic growth and also, therefore, the global economy. This is happening on top of structural weaknesses, a crisis in the property sector that have led the World Bank to predict that this year China's growth rate is going to lag the rest of Asia for the first time since 1990, and has led to significant unemployment, particularly among youth in China. Perhaps what was most notable, and we'll discuss this with the panel, is the lack of traditional focus in the speech on economic growth or on reform issues and development, and the stepped up focus on ideology and on the importance of security in particular. And that word is everywhere in the work report. The securitization of everything, internal and external, in the economy, technology, culture, and overseas interests, and a related focus on self-sufficiency. Reducing dependence on the United States, reducing dependence on the global order, certainly technologically, but also economically and otherwise. And this is part of what we see here in terms of a darker vision generally of the external security environment. And the section on foreign policy paints a really dark picture of a world dominated by forces hostile to Beijing's interests. We see in the speech this pervasive threat mentality that pervades, I think, Xi's thinking, and an increased focus on the bullying of foreign powers looking to suppress and contain China, which is, of course, a reference mainly to the United States. And the report specifically defines China's approach to global affairs in opposition to Washington's perceived failings on the world stage. And I think there's evidence in here that Xi sees war potentially as an increasingly likely prospect with the United States. And that brings us to the Taiwan issue. The formulations on Taiwan, as I'm sure we'll discuss with the panel, were not new in this report, despite some folks focusing on the language around not renouncing the use of force. But these are not new formulations that Xi Jinping put in the report. But there does seem to be some stepped up focus on foreign interference in the Taiwan Strait issue, which, of course, again, we can think of as primarily directed at the United States. And given the rising tensions over this issue between China and the United States and with Taiwan itself, there's no reason, I think, to expect a political solution that sets us on a more stable course anytime soon. So we have a lot to discuss with this group, including how the U.S. and our allies ought to be thinking about how to respond to a China that looks set to double down on Xi's approach thus far. And I want to ensure that we have ample time for questions from our members that the panel can address toward the second half of our time, which is what makes this engagement unique. So let me turn now to our panelists for their initial takeaways from what we've seen from the Party Congress thus far and what it means, and then we'll move on to a panel discussion, and then we'll save the last half of our time today for questions and answers from the audience. So maybe I'll turn things over to Joanna to kick things off.
Thank you, Dave, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to start off with sort of maybe taking a bit of a contrary position, which is, as Dave said, I think that a lot of what we saw coming out of the Congress so far, not necessarily a lot of new that has come out, right? Since so much of what we've seen had already been signaled by the party for a while. I mean, I think, honestly, the most surprising thing was the very pointed protest against Xi Jinping that took place right before the Congress started, with the banners that were put up in Beijing. Yes, the de-emphasis on economic growth as the party's sort of major purpose and source of legitimacy, and the elevation of security issues, right? Security from COVID, security from, the secessionists in Taiwan and Hong Kong. Those are noteworthy, but again, nothing that really diverges from the party's recent rhetoric and trends. I think what has been interesting to me has been looking back to where we were 5 years ago, right after the 19th Congress, where there were so many pieces that were written then, analyzing which individual took which position, what faction were they in, what did it say about potential constraints on Xi's power or internal dissent within the party. We're seeing those pieces again. We are definitely going to see more of them, certainly after the announcements are made, tomorrow. But I guess the question comes down to me is like, does any of this matter anymore, right? Are we really going to believe that because so-and-so gets a seat or a higher position, it's going to have any real meaningful effect on how major decisions are going to be made moving forward? And I know, for us as analysts, we're by nature, we're looking for data points, right? We want the dots to connect to draw a new conclusion. And I guess I'm really sort of circling around an argument that, you know, the party Congress is kind of irrelevant. You know, you can parse the language, you can parse the announcements, we can scrutinize the decisions, but none of that's going to make a difference if the people's leader, Xi Jinping, decides to go in a different direction in 6 months or a year. Now, I recognize there's a lot of caveats there. There's oversimplification, right? Xi Jinping getting another term, the breach of that norm is of course important. The Politburo and the senior leadership, of course, they are important. But you know, a colleague of mine put it, I thought, really nicely this week, that the Congress is starting to feel like a very long in-person meeting that should have been an email. And more importantly, from my perspective, is it's really not going to change how much worse things have gotten for Chinese people in the last 5 and 10 years. And now, you know, the very strong likelihood that things for people will continue to get worse now that Xi Jinping is going to be sticking around. So I will start with that.
That's great. Thank you, Joanna. It's a great way to kick things off and kind of have that view that maybe this doesn't, you know, end up mattering all that much given where Xi Jinping is already taking China. We can certainly dig into that. Hong, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Just to respond to Joanna's remark, of course, Xi will decide where to go and what policy initiative he will push forward. But remember, China is a big country. The Communist Party itself has 94 million members, and therefore it takes a while to turn the ship around. So Xi just cannot change policy at the drop of a pin. It needs time to pronounce it and permeate it throughout the power apparatus. Having said that, I think that we have to step back and recognize that prior to the Congress, there were fears that Xi will steer policy too much toward national security at the expense of economic growth. And there were expectations that there could be concrete measures to relieve the zero COVID policy, to help the property sector, and to ease on crackdown of the tech sector. My takeaway from Xi's 72-page report is that, number one, the fear was a bit overdone because Xi came across as more balanced and nuanced than fear, even though he introduced more uncertainty in how the outside world can understand and engage his future policy actions. And secondly, the expectation will be disappointed because National Congress is the place to debate and announce major policy initiative and long-term goals, not the place to announce short-term policy adjustment measures. Concretely, I think that Xi reaffirmed the Communist Party's top priority to promote quality economic growth and development, to build a modern socialist country by mid-century, concretely by doubling GDP between now and 2035. That means growth of about 4.7 per annum between now and then, which in my view is feasible, doable, but not easy and not at all assured. The key thing that he repeats many times more than anything else is modernization of both the economy and the military. And modernization will be run by promoting greater self-reliance by China in science and technology, fostering indigenous innovations as a new engine of growth, because Xi Jinping recognized and interestingly repeated the former Premier Wen Xiaopao 12 years ago. He observed that the Chinese economy is unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. And she wants to complete the rebalancing of the economy to promote growth. The key things that he introduced in the equation is two things. One is common prosperity, which we can discuss a little bit later today, but basically to make sure that the inequality in wealth and income distribution in China, which is on par with the US, will be addressed over time. And secondly, the concept of holistic national security, which intersect with the economy by stressing economic security as well in terms of securing reliable supply of key things, energy, food, key minerals, and supply chain. In that context, what we can clearly expect from the economic point of view is continued decoupling or bifurcation of the global economy into a US sphere and Chinese sphere, particularly in high-tech area, which we see that is really happening fast in the semiconductor high-tech arena, where the US has stepped up additional and comprehensive control measures against support to China. And for domestically, we will see after the Congress, with the National Congress in March, like Dave alluded to earlier, more concrete measures, and particularly with new government and cabinet officers being lined up, what they will do to address near-term growth. We have seen some initiatives so far in supporting the property sector, some change in the language referring to dynamic zero COVID instead of rigid zero COVID. So we will see if those things can be carried forward. Just one more thing to add is that the uncertainty I mentioned is that between the quality growth of the economy, common prosperity, and holistic security, it is difficult to see where the line will be drawn. And of course, Xi Jinping will decide where to tilt one way or the other. And that is the key uncertainty and difficulty for people outside of the country and even inside the country to understand and to gauge how policy will be developed in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Hung. You've covered a lot of ground there, a lot of things to dig into around common prosperity, how to balance economic security and growth, what's going to happen to the private sector in the 5 years to come and beyond. So a lot that we'll dig into there in the conversation. John, turn over to you.
I'm not sure there's much turf left after Joanna and Hung. Those were excellent summaries. I just sort of observed that, as you mentioned in the outset, the theme is continuity, which shouldn't surprise us given Xi Jinping is inaugurating a third term, which had been unprecedented since the organized process for leadership session adopted after the death of Mao and especially after Deng Xiaoping. In a way, I see these policies, this continuity, but continuity on kind of a darker road, than we saw at the 18th or 19th Party Congress, the sort of self-fulfilling prophecies. Xi Jinping and the policies that he started adopting as far back as 2014 was kind of predicting a period of much more intensified strategic rivalry with the United States. It wasn't prominent as a driver of the 18th Party Congress third plenum economic reforms, most of which have not been realized. Some have kind of at a kind of super macro level. But it's this idea that as rivalry intensified, as the comprehensive power differential between the United States and China narrowed, the US would become a much more aggressive and even violent, hegemon, to use their term for us. And so that's kind of where we are. And then, of course, on the eve of the Party Congress, the Biden administration announced what looked like could be broad restrictions on semiconductor fabrication and technology, especially focused on very advanced chips that use very exquisite processes or focus on artificial intelligence and a few other core cutting edge areas. Xi Jinping launched the Semiconductor Industry Initiative in 2014, precisely to insulate China. And it's notable because we all know that there are a few countries that have a lead in semiconductors. Sort of the US as the intellectual property leader, Taiwan as a processing and fabrication foundry leader, and then South Korea and a few others, the Netherlands in X-ray lithography or extreme ultraviolet lithography. China is the only one that's trying to build a comprehensive supply chain internally. The rest of us have gotten used to relying on Japan for chemicals that are essential to semiconductors, on the United States for intellectual property and design, on Taiwan for fabrication. So in a way, the future that she foresaw and perhaps feared is what has come to pass. Has the staggering burden of being correct. And I wouldn't put too much of a laurel wreath on that, because certainly some of this is self-fulfilling behavior. If you act aggressively, if you are pretty broad and aggressive in adopting, stealing, borrowing, innovating foreign technology, and you shouldn't be surprised when the world responds. I am struck, and I agree very much with Hung's comments on the expansion of the concept of security beyond external or military affairs. And unfortunately, the key meeting that will be held in December, where the PLA will digest the implications of the Party Congress and Xi's guidance is usually not public. It's usually not even acknowledged. It'll be the annual enlarged meeting of the Central Military Commission. And then we will be left to sort of parse the tea leaves on how the military's training and guidance comes out in a more diffuse manner in the year ahead.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think those issues around the impact of what we're seeing in terms of the tech bifurcation, the recent actions by the Biden administration, China's reaction to them, and where that leads us, given as you were saying, China intends to build a comprehensive supply chain internally. I think is we'll dig into that, as well as what you were just saying about the PLA and what the language about the securitization of everything in China means for the PLA and its approach. So I will jump into a panel conversation now, but I want to flag for the audience. We will turn to audience questions in about 10 minutes time, if not before. So please do put your questions that you might have in the using the chat function if you prefer, or just raise your hand in the tab, and we'll get to your questions very shortly. So maybe we'll kick things off. I just want to ask a somewhat, maybe it's a provocative question, maybe at this point it isn't, but just to ask, does the panel think now that China is unquestionably a dictatorship? And if so, what are the implications of that? And what are the risks that flow from that in terms of over-centralization of power, and how that could approach and affect some of the policy directions that you were all just touching on? So I'll just kind of open it up to the panel to see if anyone wants to jump on that question.
Well, if I may,
I'm happy to. Go ahead.
Yeah, of course, China has always been, since 1949, a dictatorship of the people. The question is, in what form dictatorship has been exercised? Until recently, and after Deng Xiaoping's reform effort, dictatorship was exercised more collectively among a group of leaders in the Chinese Communist Party, first the Politburo and then the Standing Committee of the Politburo. Now it looks like it's more and more exercised by a single core leader of the leadership, core of the leadership, Xi Jinping. But dictatorship of the Communist Party has always been the case for China.
Yeah, the word like dictator, it carries so many trappings, Dave. I don't think we've quite reached the point where Xi Jinping has, as the sole arbiter of everything, politicized everything. I think there is more of a political tone, even onto personal decisions, because some of the starkest dictatorships in history, that was kind of what colored them. Whether you're talking Stalin or the Third Reich, or some of the lesser examples. I think the biggest difference is, and I think this is close to what Hung noted, is it used to be that it was so it was a dictatorship that reflected a variety of interests. And I think that's part of the reason Xi Jinping rose to power, is by the end of the term of Hu Jintao, there was, I think, a consensus among elites and leaving the regime in a position where it could no longer make hard decisions on military structural reform, on defense of his external rights and sovereignty. I use this term too much, but it still, I think, works. Is you have to remember, Xi Jinping did not knife fight his way to the top. This wasn't some covert campaign where he hid his true preferences until he was ensconced in the center. He is who he is, the child of a revolutionary elder. And someone who represented, a term that still resonates for especially the oldest generation, someone who will defend the graves of the revolutionary, someone who will stand up for Marxist-Leninism and reharden that system for what they viewed as a much more aggressive attempts by the United States as China became a challenge to US dominance.
Yeah, I just jump. I mean, yes, I think China is a dictatorship. I think that to John's point earlier, Xi Jinping did not knife fight his way to the top, but since he became sort of the Secretary General of the party, what he has done in terms of the purges of the party, eliminating competition within the party, putting his own people in place. I think in terms of implications, what does it mean that China's a dictatorship? There is a lot more sort of power centralized in him in terms of the diffuseness, the size of China and its diffuseness. Now there are people who are looking to him and trying to interpret and sort of model their behavior based on what they think he wants. And I think that can, as that continues to play out more, you know, as Hong said earlier, it's a big country. But when you have a lot of people who are wanting to demonstrate that they're on the right side of the leader, I think that can lead to real problems, you know, in terms of how policies ultimately start to get implemented, and real excesses in how local level leaders may start to behave.
Yeah, I think those are all really thoughtful comments, and I would just add to kind of answer my own question that I think, you know, in the direction that you were going, Joanna, I think right now, you know, a lot as someone who's studied kind of the nature of personalist dictatorships and the impact that can have on a system and what that can mean for policy, I think, you know, looking at how we're heading towards even more of an echo chamber and a reduced, you know, feedback cycle of information to Xi Jinping, in a system where, yes, we all agree it's been a dictatorship for a long time, but that shift from a collective leadership model, right? And this shift towards something where really Xi Jinping is the only one whose ultimate opinion matters, is a significant one. And I agree with Hong. You still have institutionalized systems throughout the party system, throughout the party state system. The government does still matter in many domains, so we shouldn't underestimate that. And I think it's important to note that Xi is different than Mao. I think Mao was more willing to just burn things down, and Xi wants to have a strong party that leads an effective technocratic government in many ways, and she's trying to figure out how to be, as the old saying goes in the Chinese system, both red and expert, and to make sure that China has an efficient government while at the same time having increased party control and this focus on security. And I think that's the key question going forward is, can that work, right? And what does this increasingly personalist system mean for China if Xi Jinping is not getting the information that he needs to make decisions, if he's ultimately the one who's going to make be the key voice at the end of the day. I want to turn to some of the things that Hong you touched on in terms of economic policy and what we're seeing come out of the Party Congress and what we've just been seeing from Xi generally in terms of this focus on, as you were saying, kind of rebalancing the economy, common prosperity. And what that means in terms of reducing inequality in the system, while at the same time also trying to focus on, boosting domestic demand. And do you see any indications that we're going in that direction now? That's been oft stated for a long time that we're going to focus on boosting domestic demand and we're going to reduce the reliance on excessive investment. Do you think that's going to happen? And where do you see Xi's crackdown that we've seen in the last several years in the private sector fitting into that? Do you think that we'll see even more of that, or do you think there'll be a bit of a pullback from that as there's a recognition that China has some serious economic growth challenges facing it and needs the private sector in order to overcome them?
Thank you, Dave. I think that at least in words and intention, Xi Jinping recognizes the challenges and the shortcomings of China's economic development models, the traditional one based on net export and investment in fixed assets. So he wants to change that, as has been previous leaders of the country, by promoting domestic demand. And he, in his speech, really emphasized leveraging the power of consumption to spur growth by allowing wealth and income accumulation to proceed according to the growth of the economy, wage increase to keep pace with productivity increase. And basically, in terms of common prosperity, he aims to protect what he called legitimate earnings and income, to adjust excessive income, and to prohibit illicit income, it sounds nice. But again, the problem is Xi and the party will decide which is which among those categories, and that opens up some uncertainty, particularly among wealthy people and so on in China. But that is part of the common prosperity, which again, he went into some length to say that it is basically to give equitable access to the people, to public services and public safety net in China, including social security, including social unemployment insurance and so on, which is the right thing to do. And I think more taxation probably will be on the table as well, including capital gains tax, housing profit tax, and inheritance taxes to contribute to the budget. In terms of reform and opening up, I think that he qualified the term by saying that yes, China will strive to promote high standard reform and high standard opening up, in the sense that they will reform in the sense of making use of market mechanism where it is useful and where it is needed, but reassert party control where necessary. And between market mechanism and party control, again, they have existed throughout the reform period, but how different leaders kind of draw the balance makes a difference. And in case of Xi Jinping, while keeping market mechanism, he probably rely more and more on party control. In terms of opening up, we should not forget that he really wants to reduce reliance of China, the Chinese economy, on the US and on Europe, but promote and increase trade and investment relationship with the rest of the world. And indeed, China has made very good progress in this respect. Looking at the Belt and Road Initiative, trade volume between China and Belt and Road country amounted to 1.6 trillion with a T, $trillion last year, more than double the volume of trade between China and the US and China and the EU. So I think that simply to say China refused to open up further is wrong. They want to open up, but selectively, strategically, on their terms, and not taking interference from the West.
Great, thanks. Any thoughts, John or John, on that, or those economic questions, or more broadly, whether we should expect China to continue to open up in terms of literally allowing people to come and go from China again, and what effects we're seeing economically from Xi's policies, but also from zero COVID and the expectations that potentially it won't be lifted for quite some time, and if it is, maybe it won't be lifted entirely, and some of the controls and the dynamics we've seen put in place in terms of cutting some ties internationally might remain. Any thoughts in that area?
I'm starting to wonder, they just call these musings of a retired guy, but I'm kind of wondering if what we viewed as a real net negative, the zero COVID policy, is actually useful to the regime as a way of expanding social control. I mean, on the one hand, there's some very pragmatic and fairly stark considerations where they haven't adopted mass vaccination with effective mRNA vaccines. They still have 1/100th per capita ICU bed capacity of the United States or the rest of the developed world. So the problem is if they were going to let it rip and lift COVID restrictions without mass vaccination with imported vaccine, they have to be prepared for an enormous number of dead people, and they had a lot of pride in their low COVID death count. I think it's only 5,200 by their official numbers. Even if you think reality is multiples of that, they can still, they'd have to lose a lot more in order to be compared to the United States as a COVID disaster. But I'm starting to wonder if they find political utility here. I don't know. It's kind of a chilling thought. At some point, they are, of course, paying a terrible price, not just in industrial output and the ability of foreigners to travel, but I was struck by Hong's comments about the growing importance of sort of the non-US, non-European world as for trade, for a source of exports and then source of markets. I want to make sure we're not too stuck in our thinking about what used to be important to them 5 years ago as a driver of what will remain important to them 5 years hence.
Yeah, I agree, John. Actually, I am in that dark place in terms of thinking that the leadership and Xi Jinping personally thinks that there's real benefits in terms of the controls that they've put on place on society through this period with zero COVID. And I think we should expect many of those controls to remain. And I think that when we think about why has the party continued to maintain this policy, part of it is, yes, it's been, Xi has tied his a lot of his what he's been claiming in terms of credit, in terms of successes under under the pandemic to the zero COVID policy. So that's been a reason why he wouldn't want to pull away from it. There's the concern about, given where China's society is and the impact of not having much of the society vaccinated, certainly not with mRNA, and not exposed generally to these variants. What could that mean if you pull it away? But I think also a general belief, at least in certain quarters of the party and at the top, that they benefit in terms of all these security dynamics we've been talking about from keeping some of these controls.
Yeah, no, I was going to jump in on a slight tangent here, just how this relates to Hong Kong, for example, right? You know, because Hong Kong is a place where he's very specifically takes credit for the central party's intervention to restore stability. But you know, in terms of sort of moving forward, you know, how much I'm really interested to try and understand how much policy divergence is Hong Kong going to be allowed, right? It's trying to win back its position as a hub. It's been experimenting with lifting of its own COVID restrictions, changing up its visa policies to bring back the expats who were driven away. You know, after years of sort of pandemic enforced unity with the PRC. And so, you know, Hong Kong, it was my home, right? So Hong Kong, he needs to be allowed to be Hong Kong to survive as an economic hub. And I don't know, can its economic sort of liberalism survive without other freedoms? You know, with the national security law in place, you know, this conversation sort of makes me think about Hong Kong as a case of, you know, how much opening is going to be allowed in that situation. And I don't have answers. I worry about it a lot, but those are questions that I wonder about.
Can I comment on John's earlier statement on the COVID control? I think that we already have some worrisome example there, because people in China are required to have a COVID apps on their cell phone, and the cell phone monitor their body temperature and all the bodily function and communicate it to the central medical archives. And if your temperature is up, then it's flash red and you have to quarantine yourself. In fact, a few months ago, when people started to demonstrate in some of the provincial banks in China against the non-delivery of apartments and houses, which they paid for with their mortgages and refused to service the mortgage, people were receiving the red COVID alert to prevent them from gathering and participate in the demonstration. So it's clear that these COVID control devices are being used increasingly for political and social control, which is kind of ominous.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think before we leave this subject, maybe just, Joanna, one question directed at you, which is, you know, we've seen, as we've already discussed, increasing repressive environment inside China and in Hong Kong in particular over the last 5 years. There was some commentary on that in the work report. I think some, you know, about how the successes of making Hong Kong function and its governance. So number one, is there any reason for hope in that domain? And then relatedly, what do you think that and others should jump in here as well, what is constructive at this point for the United States and also our allies to be doing in terms of trying to help the Chinese people as they live through this more impressive environment? And are there things that we can do and have already done and might do in the future that are actually counterproductive and make it more likely that things could get worse, or that the regime is even less responsive to international outrage about its human rights atrocities?
Yeah. Thanks. So I'll just jump in with, you know, my work really is focused on sort of the democracy and human rights space. And from that perspective, China is 1 billion plus people who are subject to a system of governance that they have no choice in. Right? And so over the last 10 years, as I was alluding to earlier, you know, I think for Chinese people in real ways, their life has become worse, right? We have a civil society in China that has been incredibly robust, right? It used to be even more so. So much of the advances in terms of rights protection in China came from civil society. So whether that's, you know, advocacy on migrant workers or equality of pay or treatment of people with disabilities, all of these things were driven by civil society because there's, you know, and a lack of other kinds of political representation. That's where the sort of citizen advocacy is coming from. Now, under Xi Jinping, in the 10 years that he has been in power, we have seen all of that constrict. You know, the squeezing of space for independent civil society, the co-opting of civil society, the crackdown on freedom of expression, the what Hung was referring to in terms of real limits on movement, and this use of technology to monitor people and continue to sort of monitor them and keep them in places where, you know, that the government wants them to be. You know, all of that plus crimes against humanity that may amount to genocide in Xinjiang, and, you know, the ongoing detention of rights defenders and other independent voices, plus what's been happening in Hong Kong. So, you know, I think there are these very tangible ways in which, you know, what sort of Xi has led and what the CCP has led has really been detrimental to Chinese people. And what all of that sort of says to me is, you know, these are not the actions of a confident leadership, right? This is to me, this is the actions of a very bristle leadership that is frightened of its people. And so in that context, looking forward, the only way to go is to continue to repress and to continue to tighten and control that space. And so, you know, I think the prospects for Chinese people moving forward are going to be sort of this continued sort of limitations on their freedom, and it will be worse for some parts of China and some Chinese people than for others. In terms of sort of you know, like what's constructive moving forward, you know, I think one of the ways we look at this is that the way in which China treats its own people, there is sort of this through line for the way in which then China behaves in the world, this kind of this effort to shape an environment in which sort of China's power, CCP's dominance is able to be protected. And so, you know, I think this increasing awareness within the US, sort of between allies, of the ways in which China is acting in the world, the need for sort of allies to continue to demonstrate solidarity, to sort of, you know, like for democracies essentially to sort of work together to kind of push back on the kinds of sort of more predatory or sort of malign behavior that we've seen, both outside China and inside, that needs to continue. And so that would be, I think, part of where I think, you know, I would hope to see sort of certainly the US going in the near future.
Thanks, Joe. Sorry, Hung, go on.
Yeah, the key challenge is for the US and the West in general to find a way to both compete and coexist with China, now that we understand China, what China is all about and what it is intended to do. So as we can manage the relationship, the competition in a way to avoid catastrophic military conflict, which is no good for anyone. And one of the way to look about that is basically to look at trade relationship. I think that trade between China and the US and China and US probably cannot be continued under the old global open rule-based WTO system. And it has to migrate more and more toward bilateral managed outcome-based trade, more or less under Trump presidency, which say that if you do this to our company, we do the same to your company. If you accumulate a certain such trade surplus, you have to take action to reduce it. That kind of things, which is transactional, concrete, to avoid the impact of the different system in China imposing on the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point on economic reciprocity, and just I think it's still an open question as to where the trade war has gone and where it's going to go in the next year or two, because I think there was more expectation of potential change in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. But I want to come back. First, I want to say we will get to questions in a second. So please, audience, raise your hand if you have a question. And I know we have at least 1 or 2 questions in the chat already. But before we get to that, just on the point you just made, Hung, on the, you know, how to compete and how to confront without landing ourselves in a catastrophic war with China. I just want to touch on the Taiwan question, and maybe John, I'll turn to you to answer this, and others jump in. But You were mentioning in your opening remarks, what the PLA is going to do at the expanded CMC meeting in December, and how they might interpret what was in the work report, and what the focus on security in the external environment and the language on Taiwan means for how the PLA is thinking about how to prepare for a potential Taiwan crisis. There's been a lot of discussion just in the last week around Secretary Blinken's comments out at Stanford this week about China perhaps having moved up its timeline for as they term it, reunification with Taiwan. So I just want to get your sense of where you think, how you think the Chinese leaders and the PLA are thinking about a potential Taiwan crisis, and the need to either be prepared at an earlier stage for that crisis, or to actually be shifting mindset at this point about when they may feel the need to compel reunification as a result of their own internal logic, or what the U.S. and Taiwan are doing.
I think Taiwan still remains a crisis that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party seek to avoid, rather than an opportunity they're trying to seize. I think the increased heat and light, there are factors such as Taiwan's elections in 2 years that are going to drive this dynamic the way they usually do a bit. But it's basically become now tied directly to the dynamic of strategic rivalry with the United States, where you've got voices in the US and then some in China that are feeding on this anticipation that what's become primarily an economic and representational and, if you will, values rivalry in the rest of the world could soon become a security rivalry in East Asia. The PLA, though, has some constraints. They've made amazing progress in technical modernization. They're in the 7th year of a highly ambitious military restructuring that's comparable to our Goldwater Nichols. And students in the U.S. military will remember that it took us decades to really absorb the purpose of Goldwater Nichols and be able to realize battlefield capacities for large-scale integrated joint operations. And that is the task that was given to the PLA in 2016, which is to create unified commands that cut across all services, and to be able to realize, I hate this word, but the synergy of multiple avenues of military, political, cyber, and other effects that can produce victory on the battlefield. So even if Taiwan became a more proximate crisis, not of China's choosing, in the next few years, despite the progress the PLA's made, I don't think they're ready. Now, having said that, if Taiwan and or the United States took clear steps to permanently alter the basis for U.S.-China relations, the Shanghai Communique and the other communiques, if Taiwan declared independence, and perhaps that's important if the U.S. recognized or supported that, if, say, a new U.S. Congress comes in that becomes even more aggressive on arms sales and on U.S. taxpayer funding for weapons for Taiwan, or increased level of training, especially in-person training with Taiwan military, then I think the Chinese would go to war tomorrow. I mean that, in a very old-fashioned sense. They would draw a line between the past and the future, and they would start to conduct large-scale aggressive operations in all domains. It wouldn't mean that the PLA would try to invade Taiwan the next day or even 6 months later. It would mean that China would use entire regime capabilities to cut off Taiwan from the outside world, to truncate its economy, to isolate the people, and to make them more afraid and concerned about the path that either they chose or has been chosen for them. And so I think we're kind of fraught. I've never been this pessimistic about the trajectory of cross-strait in U.S.-China over the Taiwan issue, because the things that were the pillars of stability on this issue, which was relative military balance on the Taiwan Strait, lack of capacity on the part of the PLA for really compelling an outcome, a robust dual-party or multi-party democracy on Taiwan, and then the standard position of the United States that opposed changes to the status quo by either side. Those have all weakened in the last 5 or 6 years. The Chinese have an absolute military advantage vis-a-vis Taiwan. And from the voices of many, U.S. current active duty and retired military, you can tell that, they kind of live in our head. on the defense side because of these new capabilities that pose challenges to U.S. ability to effectively and quickly intervene in a conflict. And I just don't see that changing, unfortunately, unless we have a crisis that doesn't devolve into conflict, where all sides are forced to sort of really assess the path we're on and whether we want to maybe take some different steps to build assurance and move toward preventing war rather than winning one.
Can I add a comment here?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the Taiwan, China, and the US is really has a fundamental problem in the sense that the key pillar of relationship is the Shanghai Communique, which essentially say that status quo should be preserved and should not be changed unilaterally by military means. But that basis has been weakened by development both in Taiwan and in China. In Taiwan, more, like you say, more democratization, development of the economy, commanding height in computer chip and so on, enhance and increase the value of Taiwan and the stake of the West in preserving the system in Taiwan. At the same time, China sees that Taiwan, after the Kuomintang's losing the presidency and moving away from the 1992 consensus, which both parties recognize that there is one China and Taiwan is part of that one China. The current leadership in Taiwan refused to accept that. And therefore, China sees the chances for peaceful unification receding further and further. And if they allow status quo to persist, younger generation of Taiwanese will move even further away from identifying themselves with the Chinese and mainland China. And therefore, from China's point of view, which I think we should study the white paper China issued a few months ago on Taiwan seriously, because that contains, I think, the roadmap for China in terms of what they will do. They will first try all means to coerce Taiwan to at least accept the 1992 consensus, and failing that, eventually they will have to resort to other means. But for them, things are not looking good in the sense of the longer they wait, the less likely they will achieve the unification with Taiwan peacefully.
I want to turn to the tech issue, but Joe, any words on that you wanted to add, or should we move on? Okay. So a question in the chat, which I think relates well to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the bifurcation in the tech space and the serious measures that we saw from the Biden administration just in the last 2 weeks, from Byron Callan, which is, any thoughts on the timing of the administration's announcement of actions aimed at China on semiconductors and also potentially AI, and we've seen even just today that this might be expanded to AI and quantum. Was this rushed based on something going on in China is the question, and was it calculated, do you all think, to elicit an action or reaction during the Congress? It certainly was striking that it was undertaken right at this time, or is it just a coincidence? John, go ahead.
I'd probably go with coincidence. I think there's been tension in the Biden administration since it started, and even before the Biden administration, between steps to curtail the velocity of China's technology independence, especially in something as important as semiconductors. And originally they had enacted rules that didn't sufficiently, in the view of those who are more security concerned, didn't sufficiently constrain China. So I felt like there was a bureaucratic battle that I think circumstantially was won on the eve of the party Congress. And I haven't heard, and I would be surprised to find out that there was design in the timing of the decision.
Yeah, I think the timing issue is less important to me than the comprehensive scope of the new measures. And the fact that it is, in the view of many analysts, a game changer in terms of really making this technology ban on China very binding and very hurtful for China. And administration people are also aware of the fact that they really have to try to get allied countries, European countries, to at least do something at least similar to what the US has done to make sure that the export controls is effective and there's not loopholes for China or Chinese companies to get around. You are on mute, Dave.
Thanks. Sorry about that. We have just a couple minutes left. I wanted to use the one other question we had in the chat as kind of to ask a final question, which is around a comment that one of the Chinese government spokespeople made about the importance of maintaining stability in the U.S.-China relationship going forward and avoiding more tension and conflict. We've talked a lot about where China's heading, and it's not in a great direction. We've talked a lot about U.S. policy and how it is getting tougher on China, often for good reason. But I want to ask the panel as we close out here: do you see any prospect for really putting a floor under how bad things can get in the U.S.-China relationship, and what would that look like, and what's in the realm of the possible in the next year? John, you want to go ahead?
I lack good ideas, but I'll speak anyway. I think it's going to be more things that happen despite the designs or intentions or trajectory of the two sides. We're going to have elections this year. I think that there's a lot more appetite if the GOP gets control of Congress, especially the House of Representatives, to push things more aggressively. I think I hate to keep wishing we had a crisis. It doesn't have to be an existential one over Taiwan. Kim Jong-un certainly has the capacity to remind us that it was essential U.S.-China cooperation in 2017 that helped at least build a break in the trajectory we were on then. China is still highly relevant. So if the need for cooperation came to the fore again, and perhaps it could happen because of something doing with Ukraine and Russia's invasion, it could be North Korea, it could be something else that sort of forces us to move past or gives our leadership and China's a capacity to justify pulling down some of the barriers that have been erected for normal interaction and commerce. But otherwise, I think we're on a pretty bad trajectory.
Yeah. Joanna or Hung, any last words on that score or anything else?
I mean, I agree with that. I think the one thing I will say is I think over the last several years, there's been this sort of increasing bipartisan sort of common understanding here in the U.S. on China, about sort of how to act in terms of China's malign sort of activities, both for us and elsewhere in the world. And I think given other things, John referenced Korea, but I think also what's been happening in Ukraine, there's been all of these other sort of geopolitical developments that are kind of creating this alignment of there's sort of China and Russia, North Korea, and then some increasing alignment between democracies, right, and between sort of the rest of the world, to push back on that, which I think also sort of points us down towards more tension in the future. I don't know if I could say, Dave, that where the floor is necessarily, which is probably problematic.
Yeah, I agree. Hung, last 20 seconds to you.
Right. If I may add that basically that statement from the Chinese official reflects the wish of China to remain engaged and open with the US and the West, but increasingly on its own terms, not accepting any criticism of its action either externally, like in the South China Sea, or domestically in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. Now, if the West can accept that, then I can see a basis for normalization of relation with China. If the West cannot accept that, then like Joanna said, we expect more tension to come and not less.
Okay. Dark way to end, but I think that's where we have to be. I want to thank our panel, Joanna, John, and Hung, for a great conversation, and I'll turn it over to Sarah to close it out.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you to our wonderful panelists for joining us today, and to our audience for your engagement and thoughtful questions. We look forward to seeing you at the next briefing and wishing you all a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.